I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, following new Russian bombardments and a huge explosion in Saratov, 600 kilometres east of Ukraine after a drone strike, we discuss a new phone call between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Then the row breaking out in Europe about which countries should be considered European for vital weapons purchases.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 20th of March, 3 years and 25 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and Dr. Benjamin Tallis, Director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative. First, over to Dom for the evolving military picture.
Well, thanks, Francis, and hello, Benjamin. Welcome. So, I know you touched on this yesterday, but it's important, I think, that we just pause for a moment and do have a look at it. What's in a word, I ask you, Francis? So, the war carried on yesterday as details of any proposed ceasefire still take shape. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that any temporary ceasefire would only apply to, quote, energy infrastructure facilities. Okay. However, after Tuesday's phone call, now you touched on this yesterday with Roland, but after the phone call between Trump and Putin, the White House statement on Tuesday said the ceasefire would apply to, quote, energy and infrastructure. Donald Trump then, still on Tuesday, then told the Washington Examiner that Putin had agreed to, quote, an immediate ceasefire on energy and infrastructure. Similarly, and we're still on Tuesday, US Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, said the temporary ceasefire covers, quote, energy and infrastructure in general. And then yesterday, President Zelensky said Ukraine is ready to implement a ceasefire on strikes against, quote, energy and civilian infrastructure. So, Francis, how important is the word and, energy infrastructure or energy and infrastructure? Now, we still don't know. And the reality is it doesn't really matter. This is just a way for Russia to kick the can down the road, to keep up the pretense of full engagement in the process because they know they've got to stay close to Trump without actually taking any action whatsoever to reduce the violence. Now, to be clear, there has been no agreement on the details of any ceasefire or when any steps will be implemented. That should not, however, be read as there being no negotiations taking place. Negotiations are well underway, I think, if not face-to-face, or through the US, or through meetings in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, but they are definitely underway in terms of trying to dominate the narrative and shift world opinion. For example, Russia's MOD says that they shot down 7 of their own drones, which were en route to striking Ukrainian energy facilities in Mykolaiv Oblast on Tuesday during the phone call. But Putin apparently issued the order to cease such operations immediately. Now, one presumes that they say this sort of thing to portray the image that they're serious about peace and they are prepared to make a gesture of goodwill regarding the ceasefire process. The Russian MOD, just on that point, they said that their forces had received orders to neutralise the drones as they were in the air. And they used Pantsir anti-defence systems to bring down 6 with a fighter jet blasting the other one out of the sky. Now, when you hear that, of course, I'm convinced they are very serious and actually very nice guys, and only an idiot would think otherwise. But anyway, just in case there was any doubt at all about their gestures of goodwill, last night Russia fired 171 drones at Ukraine. Kyiv Air Force shot down 75. I don't have figures for how many the Russian Air Force shot down, but I'm sure it'll be a very round figure. Between that and other strikes across Ukraine yesterday, 5 people were killed and 26 injured. Now, my point is, there is no ceasefire, but as ever, and just as important, what is targeted speaks volumes. It's worth noting that last night, President Zelensky said, I understand that until we agree with Russia, until there is a corresponding document on even a partial ceasefire, I think that everything will fly. So, there is no ceasefire at the moment. Don't let anyone try and shift the narrative that there is or there's any gestures of goodwill. The war is carrying on, but still the morality of what is targeted and how operations are conducted, that has not shifted, and that's where we need to maintain our focus. Now, to that end, also last night, Russia's Nicholls 2 airbase in Saratov Oblast, is about 600 kilometers east of Ukraine, was hit again by long-range Ukrainian drones from the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, in what local Russian governor Roman Busargin said was the heaviest drone strike against Saratov Oblast throughout the entire full-scale war, his words. Now, the Nicholls base is home to the big Tupolev bombers, the Tu-95s, the Tu-160 nuclear-capable heavy bombers. It hosts the 121st Guards Heavy Bomber Aviation Regiment and also stores cruise missiles, the KH-101s and the KH-55s. Now, Mr. Busargin said that the drone attack had left the airfield on fire and that nearby residents had been evacuated. Russian state media later said there were 10 victims of the attack, but didn't give any other details. Very graphic footage online you'll see. I think the strike happened in the early hours of the morning, but when it was still daylight. So if you have a look at our website, you'll see a very, very clearly defined mushroom cloud over the Nicholls base. Now, on the ground in Ukraine and Russia, no big move to the front lines, but I do note that the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, citing geolocated footage from yesterday, say Ukrainian forces have continued to advance, albeit very marginally, in Belgorod Oblast. So this is about 40 km southeast down the border from Suja. Ukrainian forces have effectively been pushed out of the Kursk Oblast, but just as that Trump and Putin phone call was ending, there were reports of a push over the border further to the south. Now, that does seem to have happened. It's tiny. It's taken a tiny sliver. But if anything has been proven through this so-called peace negotiation process, it's that having any amount of Russian land held by Ukrainian forces is an absolute thorn in the side of the Kremlin. And so it almost doesn't matter how much land has been taken. It's whether or not Ukraine can hold on to it. So we will obviously be watching that one very closely. I also know actually that Reuters today, citing a report, say that Ukrainian soldiers fighting in the Kursk region have never and have not been encircled by Moscow's troops. You may remember that that claim was made last week. Now, US intelligence shared with the White House found that Ukraine's forces have lost ground, as I said, but are not surrounded. This is Reuters reporting from 3 US and European unnamed officials. The claim that Ukrainian forces in Kursk were encircled first came from Moscow, you'll remember, with Putin saying they would need to surrender or die. And then, in his latest, shall we say, factual misfortune, Donald Trump just amplified the Kremlin's line, didn't shut it down. And that idea, this encirclement, and Trump saying he'd asked Putin to do a favour and save their lives, and all that kind of guff, took hold. Anyway, it's all a complete fantasy. Now, also yesterday, and a bit more fallout from that Trump-Putin phone call, Ukraine and Russia did conduct that prisoner of war exchange that was talked about, 175 from each country. And then bringing us up to date, Francis, today, Britain's MOD tweeted this morning that Russian casualties since the start of the full-scale invasion have reached 900,000. 900,000, with between 200 and 250,000 dead. 900. So they are well on their way to hitting the 1 million casualty figure by their Victory Day parade in Moscow in May. Now, UK's MOD, the Defence Intelligence section there, said Putin and Russian military leadership are almost certainly prepared to tolerate continuously high casualty rates so long as this does not negatively affect public or elite support for the war. Interesting use of the word elite, talking about the sort of oligarchs and the Suvaliki there. And they will tolerate it as long as the losses can be replaced. They say that Putin and the Russian leadership highly likely place significantly less value on the lives of ethnic minority Russian citizens from impoverished regions, with Russia's recruitment efforts consequently focused disproportionately on those areas. What a nice bunch. And last one for me, Francis, and also happening today, dozens of military chiefs from countries that will likely form whatever this coalition of the willing eventually shapes up to be, are meeting to discuss practical details. What Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said earlier this week said was an operational meeting as opposed to the sort of political side of things. Although Keir Starmer is expected to show his face later this afternoon. Now, I understand that this meeting is going to be at the level below service chiefs and CDS, Chief of Defence Staff. So that would be about the 3-star level. The meeting is happening in Northwood in northwest London. That's home to Britain's permanent joint headquarters. So I think it will be chaired by Britain's CJO, that's Chief of Joint Operations, the individual responsible for all British military overseas deployments. There's not a huge amount known about the current incumbent, but I can exclusively reveal that he is rubbish at darts and that he got a right old monk on with me for naming every air assault operation we conducted in southern Afghanistan in 2010-11 around my name. Hat tip now to any listeners who we deployed on operations Domain, Domestic, Condominium, Dome and many others during that time. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. The less questions asked about that, the better, I think. As we trailed in yesterday's podcast, President Trump held...
Fewer questions, Francis.
President Trump held an hour-long call with President Zelensky yesterday and posted afterwards, I've just completed a very good telephone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It lasted 1 hour. Much of the discussion was based on the call made yesterday with President Putin in order to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. So very short. Not much came out of that in terms of the readout, and it was the same from the Ukrainians too, although gradually over the course of this morning, Dom and I have been piecing together the topics of the discussion. So not long afterwards, Zelensky said one of the first steps toward fully ending the war could be ending strikes on energy and other civilian infrastructure. Interesting that he put civilian infrastructure before that. I supported this step and Ukraine confirmed that we are ready to implement it, though as Dom just covered, there's been no let-up in attacks in the past 24 hours. Now, another interesting point apparently discussed, mentioned by Zelensky today, is what to do in the case of Ukrainian settlements that would fall along a demarcation line in the event of a ceasefire. He said, and I quote, "There are regions, there are cities and towns that are cut off by a contact line. And if in some places you leave this line in place, you will simply leave these cities or towns without life. No one will return to half of the city. I told President Trump honestly, do we want Berlin? I think we both understood this was not an option. The Berlin Wall is not an option." President Trump also suggested, since their conversation, that American ownership of Ukraine's power plants could help ensure their security. He said the US could be very helpful in running the plants with its electricity and utility expertise, adding, American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Now, as the Kyiv Independent underscores, it is unclear from the readout what energy infrastructure or nuclear power plants the US could help run or acquire. Trump on the 13th said that as part of peace deal talks, he had discussed Russian-occupied territory with Ukraine, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Ukraine's largest nuclear site, of course, that has been under Russian control since the early days of the invasion. He said, just to quote again, "There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who is going to get the power plant and who is going to get this and that? And so, it's just not an easy process. But phase one is the ceasefire." So it is clearly Zaporizhzhia that is on his mind. It does still seem that the US so-called security guarantees are being tied to business interests in Ukraine. But many will argue convincingly, in my view, that business ties would never be a sufficient guarantee that Russia would not invade again. Just look at Afghanistan. Now, that is the view in Europe more widely too, where many countries continue to argue that US support will be essential for a ceasefire, if one comes, to hold. The German ambassador to Britain, who we've interviewed on this podcast before, has suggested the coalition of the willing, planning to potentially deploy a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, will only be able to proceed with that idea if there is, quote, full US involvement. Miguel Berger, who when asked if a US proposal of taking control of Ukrainian power plants would be enough of a guarantee for the coalition to press ahead, told Times Radio as follows. "To take over Ukrainian assets is not what we understand as a US backstop. What we would need is a full US involvement, intelligence, air surveillance, air defence, so that Russia understands that if they would violate a ceasefire agreement, it would mean that they also violated not only against European troops and Ukrainian, but also against the US. So the US has to be fully involved to make this operational. But the question remains, what if America is ultimately not willing to offer that? Hence the conversations between the bigwigs taking place at the summits in Paris and in London that Dom was just talking about. While progress is clearly being made at those, a row has broken out today, though, following the news that British arms companies will be excluded from the €130 billion EU fund to boost European defence unless the government signs a specific security pact with Brussels. The Telegraph's James Crisp reports that US and Turkish defence firms are also not included in the new Security Action for Europe, that's sometimes called SAFE scheme, under which member states take out loans from funds raised against the EU budget to spend on weapons. In what's considered a diplomatic victory for France, which has insisted that EU moves to rearm must incentivise governments to buy European, some 65% of the cost of weapons must be spent in either the EU, Norway or Ukraine under the plans announced yesterday. The exclusion of British companies will be a disappointment for the British government, which has lobbied the EU to be treated as European for the purposes of defence. Now, Tallis, the EU's chief diplomat, has somewhat given the game away because she said the decision to exclude the UK was related to member states and different worries, in what is almost certainly a veiled reference to French pressure. But she added, "We are working on having this defence and security partnership with the UK." Now, some feel this row is a step backwards at a time when Europe needs to be united beyond the parameters of whether states are in the European Union or not. Britain, of course, specialises in certain weaponry, and it seems illogical not to encourage purchasing via this fund from Britain's defence industry, not just because the UK is no longer part of the European Union. The French, of course, will profit from this economically if it goes ahead, as other European powers will be obliged to buy from them rather than from Britain. But there may also be an ideological component here, which goes back to the Brexit years and the debates about whether Britain was an impediment because of its hesitancy in its relationship with the European Union with regards to plans for an EU army, something that Macron has previously favoured. Now, speaking of France in relation to all of this, discussions over it potentially expanding its nuclear umbrella to include other European countries continues. And there's been an interesting piece published in the Financial Times today that points out other potential pitfalls of this approach, writing that even if France wanted to somehow expand protection to Europe, experts say its arsenal of about 300 warheads, a fraction of America's 5,000, is simply too small to protect the whole region. Russia has, by contrast, 5,580 warheads and has recently moved some to Belarus, of course. Paris also lacks tactical nuclear weapons, less powerful, shorter range ones designed for battlefield use, and has fewer options for gradual escalation than the US and Russia. If it was, the FT says, under grave threat, it would carry out a nuclear warning strike against an adversary before destroying key targets like major cities. So there are some concerns about that plan being mooted behind closed doors, hence why I think it's no coincidence today that for the first time in over 10 years, a British Prime Minister visited a nuclear-armed submarine as it returned from a record-breaking 200-day patrol. So British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the Defence Secretary John Healey met the vessel as it docked. It underscores that the British nuclear deterrent at a time of increased volatility is still present. It is a deterrent which, as we've discussed, is independent of the US in the sense of it being able to use the weapons without permission from anyone else. But because it uses up to 260 UK-designed warheads delivered, though, by US-made Trident missiles, could, in the long term, see itself vulnerable if Washington decided not to renew providing parts and security patches. But, as I say, for now, it is active and ours. And evidently London thinks it is important that the Russians and the Europeans know that. So that's where we are in the military and political developments. Before I go to our guest, Dom, that nuclear submarine story is interesting. I just wonder if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It was worth noting, though, that I think a number of signals were sent, and not all of them good as far as the MOD were concerned. So this was images of the Prime Minister and Defence Secretary on HMS Vanguard, I think, one of the 4 bombers. So Britain's got 4 nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines, and then we are in the process of bringing into service 7 Astute-class nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed, hunter-killer submarines. So this is Britain's nuclear deterrent, been at sea every hour of every day for the last 50 or something or other years. When was CASD, the continuous at-sea deterrent, when did that start? But it's 51, 52 years, something like that. It is Britain's nuclear deterrent. Now, the footage that came out from the Prime Minister and Defence Secretary, there was a short bit of film attached as well, but no sound on that for security purposes, as you would expect, so just the images. So it is sending the message that the British deterrent is still there. It sort of keeps the debate alive. Interesting, if you remember last week, I was hearing from a number of sources that they were a bit uncomfortable that Britain and other Western countries are so readily discussing nuclear capabilities at the moment. Clearly, those concerns don't go right to the very top, because there we get the Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister with having a photo opportunity on one of the bombers. Anyway, the point is not just yes, Britain has a nuclear deterrent, and you can talk about numbers. And as you absolutely correctly say there, Francis, it is a sovereign capability. It is the Prime Minister's gift is a horrible word to use in this context, but it's up to the Prime Minister whether to launch these things or not. But as a capability, a large slice of the boats comes from America. And if you think about the missile, the Trident D5 missile is an American missile. It has British warheads on it. So yes, the US are all the way through the whole capability as a whole of Britain's nuclear deterrent. So whilst they can't say yes or no to any potential firing, in the longer term, it would be very problematic for Britain's nuclear deterrent capability if we fell out with the United States. And the last point I make is that it's not a cause for celebration that this is a record-breaking patrol. I think she was at sea for 270 days or 273 days, something like that. Most of it underwater, in fact, pretty much all of it underwater, going at 2 or 3 knots, just a walking pace. These things want to be a hole in the ocean. They don't want to find anything. They don't want to be found by anything. They are silent. They're not emitting any sounds, any other kind of electromagnetic emissions. They just want to disappear and then be used as and when they have to be. But they are designed just to go away and disappear somewhere around the world. I genuinely don't know, but probably the North Atlantic, considering where the likely targets are. But it is not good news that these boats are at sea for 270 plus days. There are 4 of them. They should be on 3-month patrols and then replaced by one of the other boats. The fact that the serviceability is so poor is the reason why the boats that are operational, the 1 or 2 that are operational at any one time, is having to do these very, very long patrols. You do not want them at sea for that amount of time. It's a very unforgiving environment. If you look at the state of these things when they come back, a lot of the tiles on the outside that are there to sort of, well, amongst other things, soak up sonar. Anechoic tiles, is that what they're called? Anechoic, something like that. Anyway, they are falling off because they're perished by the seawater, and they're not supposed to be at sea for that amount of time. So the fact they are just speaks to how problematic the whole maintenance and refitting schedule is at the moment for Britain's bomber fleet. That is being replaced by the Dreadnought class in the 2030s, but the current Vanguard class of Britain's bombers are very tired indeed. The continuous at-sea deterrence is there, but they're having to have longer and longer patrols because they just don't have the backup that they really need.
Well, thanks, Dom. Returning to the subject of Europe's armament strategy, we welcome now to the podcast Dr. Benjamin Tallis, Director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative and author of a new report which argues Europe needs to prioritise emerging defence technologies. Benjamin, welcome. We've quoted previous reports you've worked on over the years, but this is the first time you've actually been on the podcast. A pleasure to have you. Can you start by summarising your report for us and your concerns about the approach Europe seems to be adopting at this juncture?
Thanks very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you and Dom on the show. I'm a long-time listener. Yes, this report looks at how to spend it, really. The money is starting to come in to European defence from the EU Safe Fund that you mentioned before, but also because countries such as Germany, belatedly, are now stepping up with massive funding, potentially of the order of 500 billion euros or more. But there's a big concern we have that they might spend it on the wrong things. They might essentially spend it on much more of the same kind of platforms that we already have. And we don't think that's going to do the trick, because we don't think that will get Europe the increased combat power, the capabilities that it needs in the time frame that it needs them. So we argue for a focus on something different, on emerging defense technologies, as you said.
And can you give us a little bit more information about what you mean when you talk about those emerging technologies? Are these drones, or are we talking about other technologies as well?
Yeah, drones are the most visible and the most obvious one that we've seen being highly effective in Ukraine. And a recent RUSI report that showed that between 60 and 70% of Russian systems that are being destroyed in Ukraine are being destroyed by tactical UAVs, so small, light drones, UAVs being uncrewed aerial vehicles. And that between 70 and 80% of battlefield casualties on both sides are being caused by drones. So strike drones in particular are one of the emerging defense technologies that we see as having extremely positive potential to rapidly upgrade Europe's combat power. But it's more than that too. There's other types of drones that are used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And they can start to provide so-called enabler functions, which allow the military to fight in the way that we want to fight without needing extensive satellite capability or really high-end enablers that the Americans have provided for us in the past. Other than that, it's mainly about battle networks. And this is a key to actually understanding how we might need to fight in future, rather than basing our thinking around particular platforms, so tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, or even fighter jets. We should be thinking about the network and how we actually get particular systems working better together. This is a point that's been made over the years by many people, but I wonder if your listeners know that, for example, the F-35 and the F-22, two very advanced fighter jets, can't really talk to each other very well. The only way to really transfer information between them is by radio, between the pilots, despite the fact they're extremely advanced, despite the fact that they are produced by the same company in the same country. So what this means is we have a lot of old kit and legacy kit like that isn't being used in the best possible way because it's not properly networked. So as well as drones, we have to actually start working on those networks. And that's what a lot of the emerging defense technology companies are doing, using artificial intelligence to actually enhance the way we connect all the different kit that we have.
Interesting. And if I could just ask Benjamin, what do you think is the worst case scenario in terms of the approach that Europe adopts for the long term or even in the short term defence procurement? What are the things that need to be, as it were, most looked out for as being bad signals from your perspective, given the nature of this report, and you think the perceived threat from Russia in the short term?
Sure. Well, we need to be buying less or perhaps fewer, Dom, new tanks, artillery pieces, infantry fighting vehicles. But if you look at the speech in which Andrius Kubilius, the European Defence and Space Commissioner, announced that he was looking for a so-called big bang in European funding for defence, he actually cited a report that said NATO is asking its member states to prepare 49 new brigades. That needs 1,200 more tanks, 900 pieces of artillery, 2,700 IFVs, 3,000 personnel carriers, and so on. And those numbers have been recently echoed by Bruegel, which is a Brussels-based think tank, very influential, talking about exactly what Europeans would need to replace the US core capabilities that we can now no longer rely on in Europe. And they're very similar figures, 1,400 tanks, 2,000 IFVs, and so on. If we start investing into that, it's not going to get us what we need in time, because our defense industrial base is, to put it bluntly, slow and expensive. They're used to producing low numbers of these very high-end, very expensive new versions of old things, of tanks and IFVs and so on. Now, we face an urgent and severe threat from Russia. There's no need to explain that to listeners to this podcast. But our calculation is that we have to be ready to not only defend against, but defeat that threat within 3 to 5 years. And if we want to do that, investing in massive quantities of these older types of equipment is not going to do the job because they simply won't get there in time. And even if they do, they might be obsolete when they arrive.
Interesting. It's all bringing back memories for me of A.G.P. Taylor's essay, War by Timetable, when powers are thinking before the First World War about how long it will take them to arm, to mobilise, and it's obviously a concern. I wonder if you could comment, Benjamin, on the way in which Central and Eastern Europe's evolving strategy could play into this. Obviously, a lot of the eyes are on Germany, and we're going to be doing a deep dive into Germany tomorrow with James Rothwell, so I'm hesitant to do that today. But I wonder if you can comment on the way in which things are changing because of the way that Europe's response has changed in the last few weeks.
Yes, absolutely. The big shift has been in Germany. And you know that I've been working on German politics for a long time. What we saw very quickly was then an agreement between the CDU and their sister party, the CSU, which is the Christian Social Union from Bavaria, and the SPD, the Social Democrats, who will likely be their coalition partner. They have a new leader, Lars Klingbeil, who's setting a very different tone. And very quickly, they were able to agree on the need to massively boost defense spending and to massively boost infrastructure spending. That has actually changed the game in terms of Germany's strategic outlook. If the weight of the world's third largest economy is going to swing behind European defense, that makes the kind of defense industrial difference that would give Putin real pause for thought. But now it's about how we spend it.
Interesting. Now, just to change the subject before I bring Dom in, I know that you're also very interested in Cold War history, as am I. And of course, we've seen the demise of the Office of Net Assessment. Now, it's a rather arcane, harmless sounding organisation in the United States. But perhaps you could fill listeners in on its importance and what its demise in the United States means potentially for the Russian threat.
Yes, certainly. It sounds about as innocuous as it gets, but the Office of Net Assessment was the Pentagon's internal think tank, most associated with someone called Andrew Marshall, who had already been at RAND for 20 years by the time he was tapped by then Defense Secretary James Schlesinger back in 1973 to set up a true internal think tank in the Pentagon to assess the balances, and this is why it's called net assessment, to assess the key balances militarily but also economically between the US and its primary rival at the time, the Soviet Union, with the understanding that they were in a long-term competition against each other and thus needed to develop competitive strategies that actually played to US strengths and played on Soviet weaknesses. Marshall was incredibly successful at this. He's a legend in strategy circles. Anyone who's read Kill Chain or any of the other recent books on US strategy will probably have heard of him. Nicknamed Yoda for his somewhat gnomic pronouncements at times, but a true legend in the strategic community who led this process of developing competitive strategies, including the so-called offset strategy, where the US sought to compensate for its relative disadvantage in conventional forces and the parity that the Soviets had been able to achieve in nuclear forces by shifting the terrain of competition to an area which was in their favor, which was the beginning of the development of semiconductors and information technology. That forced the Soviets to compete in an area they weren't good at. It imposed prohibitive costs on them and helped to actually win the Cold War by bankrupting the Soviet economy. After the end of the Cold War, he's best known for his work on the revolution in military affairs, which is what we're seeing the tail end of now with this commodification of precision warfare, which is exactly what I say we should capitalize on in Europe. So really with this report, we're trying to pick up the torch of net assessment at a time when Pete has just actually tried to, I think, cancel the ONA in the US.
Benjamin, hi, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. I wonder if I could just ask a couple as well. The points we are making about defence industrial sovereignty and defence industrial capability, Europe hopefully stepping up to the plate here. I just wonder if you could try and put this in a bit of context and flag any danger areas. I'm minded to equate what might be on the cards for Europe to the F-35. Now, of course, the F-35 is a great aircraft. I mean, it's good as a bomb truck. I don't think it's that good if it ever came to dogfighting punch-up. But I was told, and I think it's correct, that every state in the United States has some part manufactured, some part of the F-35, the manufacturing base in that state. And one of the reasons for that was so that there'd be political buy-in, so that all the congressmen, senators, et cetera, would want to vote it through because it always looks good for jobs and that's all good. But if you go down that strategy, just trying to start off with the political requirements before you start with the actual hard-edged military requirements, you might end up with a donkey as a horse designed by committee type sketch. And I wonder if you thought that if this idea is that Europe has all this money, but now tries to spread the largesse around as many different countries as possible, you end up with a slightly muted defence capability at the end of it.
Yeah, hi Dom. Great question. And you've really put your finger on one of the reasons why US defense procurement and production is really not where it should be. A lot of people in Europe seem to think the US can produce as much of whatever it wants as fast as it wants, but it really can't. They're in a hole on this too. And it's those kind of political considerations being put first that have helped get to that position. I don't think it's quite the same with the EU situation here, because what we do face in Europe is a situation where we need to build our defense industrial base. And that requires investing in that through new orders. So I think it's reasonable to actually say that Europe should buy European. What I don't think is reasonable is cutting the UK out of that, because this is cutting off your nose to spite your face. And it would be preferable if France's leadership in particular would focus on paying enough into European defence rather than just trying to profit from it, not least on the nuclear issue, as you said before, which needs a lot of development work, but also more generally on the emerging defence technologies and particularly on long-range precision strike weapons, which we need to have in mass quantity to hold Russian key governing industrial and warfighting assets at risk. There's a huge need for cooperation between the UK and France. In particular, they're major stakeholders in MBDA, which is the main missile manufacturer in Europe, from both the UK and France. And so this does seem to be a highly political move that won't actually put our deterrents first, but it does create an incentive for the UK to sign that defence pact with the EU, of course.
It sure does, which is part of the reason it's there, I guess. Now, you mentioned the revolution in military affairs earlier on, this move from mass to precision, or rather the move from the requirement for mass, i.e. Second World War, it was how many bombers do you need to drop a single bridge? And nowadays it's how many bridges can a single fighter jet drop with its payload kind of thing, that sort of move. But the revolution in military affairs was an idea. I mean, God, I remember writing essays as a second lieutenant for the bloody Bertrand Stewart essay competition. My God, in the words of Chief Brody in Jaws 2, I'm not going through that hell again. But this idea has been around for ages. Do you think is it actually a revolution? It's been around so long. Is it not just an evolution? Are we not just where technology has taken us? And as a slight adjunct to that, drones have been said for many, many years, it's the end of the tank, and yet tanks are still around. But I think we can start to say that drones really have sounded the death knell for things like towed artillery and maybe some of the rest of the tubed artillery as well. I just wonder if you could comment on those two things about, is this a revolution, and actually are we seeing it just in the last couple of years? I know drones have been around for longer, but just since the full-scale invasion and the advent of drone technology, whether or not we can start to say, yep, that is obsolete, that military capability, take it off the cards.
Yeah, always a pleasure to bring back happy memories of essay writing. The RMA has been around for a long time. Marshall's essay on this was back in 1992, and I think most people would point to the first Gulf War as, if you like, the coming out party of this way of warfighting, of precision networked warfare. But what we're seeing now is the tail end of that revolution. We're seeing its commodification as part of how it reaches its mature stage. And there's been a lot of good work on this. People like Andrew Krapinovich, who used to work with Marshall at the ONA, his fantastic book, Origins of Victory, I'd highly recommend on this. And the two facets of this mature phase of the RMA are, one, proliferation, which means this is no longer the preserve of the US. Other countries have built these so-called reconnaissance strike complexes where they can use precision weapons and precision warfare extremely effectively. And they've done it, particularly in China's case, in ways that don't seek to match US capability, but seek to counter it through things like anti-access, area denial capabilities and doctrine, which is causing the US a major headache in the Indo-Pacific at the moment. But as well as proliferation, there's also been commodification. And this is what we're seeing now. This is what is really relevant for Europe in the very short term, is that capabilities that used to cost a huge amount of money, be that battle networks or precision-guided weapons and the platforms to deliver them, are now available for a couple of €1,000. And that's been the drone revolution that you're talking about, which, so first-person view drones, other loitering munitions such as Helsing's HX-2 or the Lancets that the Russians are using. That's what we're seeing in terms of this commodification. And this is what Europe could actually cash in on in order to rapidly boost the combat power that we actually need, because it takes a lot less time to make a drone and it takes a lot less money to make a drone than it does to make an F-35 or to make a tank, for that matter. And if you put those timescales together, and also if you put the cost factor into play, so 2,000 euro drones are now capable of destroying 28 million euro tanks, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to be investing in massive amounts more of those older platforms like tanks. Should we still use those that we have? Absolutely, but we need to integrate them properly into our battle networks and to ensure that they're actually used for proper purpose. And that's going to mean something of a doctrinal evolution that is going on. But what we have to do at the same time is prepare for the revolution to come. It is almost consensus among most experts on military innovation, technology, and so on, that something big is coming from the introduction of AI, additive manufacturing or 3D printing, quantum computing, laser weapons, hypersonic weapons, and space combat, among other things. We don't know what shape that's going to take yet, but we have to get our militaries and our industrial base in shape in order to actually take advantage of it when it does. So it's those two overlapping revolutions that we have to deal with.
Thank you. Just one last one for me. I wonder if, with all these ideas that we've been discussing here, whether the role of NATO is going to become more important and the political side of NATO. So NATO does have some of its own capabilities. I think it's got a fleet of Global Hawk drones. And so it is buying its own stuff. I think aren't they based at Sigonella in Italy? Anyway, NATO has its own stuff. It's not just a wrapper to go around troop contributing nations for specific missions. And I just wonder if, as these defence industrial issues come to the fore, and this idea that you've got to be this move back to mass, but also that's very seductive to say, well, in that case, we need the really exotic weapons so that we don't have a long attritional battle. Somebody needs to be an arbiter of that. And I wonder if you see the political side of NATO and the jockeying. There's always been a Brit who's been de Sacker, for example, an American who's been Supreme Allied Commander Europe. But the political side of it, I wonder if we're going to see a greater competition for that role, because they will have almost the same, if not a greater vote than the national leaders in terms of defence industrial strategy.
Yeah, the role of NATO is going to be so interesting going forward. I mean, for all the political travails at the moment that we see with Mark Rutte's difficulties in Washington and so on, it is worth remembering exactly what you said. There are a lot of extremely capable people working at SHAPE, the supreme headquarters of the Allied powers in Europe, and across the NATO structures to actually wrestle with these issues. And NATO has been at the forefront of trying to develop defense innovation in Europe with its Diana, its Defense Innovation Accelerator, and the NATO Innovation Fund, which is actually being used to try and to accelerate the development of some of these capabilities that I've been talking about, be that battlefield robotics and networks for existing platforms, or the kind of strike drones that we're talking about as well. But there's going to be a big question going forward. Can we still rely on NATO when the first among equals within NATO is not reliable? Can we still depend on an undependable ally? And the conclusion that's being drawn around a lot of places in Europe is no, which is why we're starting to see things moving on the continent in a way that they haven't for a number of years. This raises a major question for the UK, of course. How does the UK maximize its involvement in NATO, and perhaps how does it translate that de-Sacker position into the Sacker position, either of NATO or of an emerging European pillar of NATO? That, I think, would also provide something of an answer to the question before about who is included in this definition of Europe that was mentioned before from the EU. If there is a European organization that emerges from this, which may be the best way to organize this in the short to medium term, then, of course, the Brits should be included and should play a full role.
Well, Benjamin, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really interesting hearing your reflections. Of course, we'll have a link in the show notes to those who wish to read your report. We'll have an opportunity for your final thoughts in a moment. But first, over to Dom. Dom, where do you want to leave our listeners today?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I promised my chum, Jordan, that I would say hello. Jordan from Tampa in Florida, was over in the UK for a few days with his wife, and he and I were trying to meet up for a beer. We just never quite got the diaries together, but we arranged. Well, I was in the Market Porter pub in Borough Market, in next to London Bridge, one of my favourite pubs in London. Still serves breakfast. You can still get a beer at breakfast if you want it. One of only 3, I think. Anyway, I digress. Anyway, I'm in the Market Porter, very happily tucking into a beer that they produced just for the Six Nations Rugby Championships that's just finished, and they called it the Hoppy Hooker. Hoppy because it's hops for beer, and the hooker as in the hooker in the position in rugby. So Hoppy Hooker. I'm there having a nice beer, messaging Jordan saying I'm over here, come over. And I'd had a couple, so it was a little bit of a typo. I recommended to him, and I was saying how delighted I was in the Market Porter with the Happy Hooker. And I had to then explain to Jordan a bit later, when I realised what I'd done, that this was actually a typo and not some bizarre Monday night Dom in London ritual. So I apologise for that. And Jordan, I'm sorry we didn't meet up for a beer. Thank you so much for getting in touch and for continuing to listen. I do hope you and your wife had a great weekend. And hope to catch you either this side or the other side of the pond next time. But yes, the Hoppy, well, Hookers, Hoppy or Happy. I think everyone's just. I'm going to stop now, Francis. I'm going to stop.
Happy hookers all round. Benjamin, where do you want to leave our listeners?
hard to follow that. But I actually used to have a beer in the Market Porter when I lived round the corner in Borough. So very nice to be reminded of that. Where to leave listeners? Okay, we have a very short time to get ready to face the Russian threat, and we have to be ready to clearly defeat it if we want to deter it. We can't afford to run Russia's race while doing so, so let's play to our strengths in industry and innovation and get our defense base in shape. We can do this using these emerging defense technologies, so that's what we have to bet on going forward for the short term, but also to get us in shape for that revolution to come in the longer term.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from Ukraine, please subscribe to The Telegraph at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please follow Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist in your language. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Thank you, and best wishes from London.